Now, much like any build, the very first task is to actually design and plan the build, planning the cooling required, the tasks that you need to actually undertake with that computer, and then the components that you'll need to bring in order to accomplish those tasks. So for this one, I'm using a 7940X Intel CPU. It's a couple generations old, and I got this one secondhand, but it'll serve just fine in this. I've got an X299 EVGA dark motherboard and 32 gigabytes of RAM. No RGB. This is going to be a pretty straightforward build. I'm not a huge fan of RGB, and I think you can save that little tiny bit of power and maybe get a little bit better performance or thermals. It really doesn't make too much of a difference. I'm just not a fan of the rainbow puke. So the very first thing I do when I get a new motherboard or a new build set up is collect all the parts, unbox most of the things, get all that stuff sorted, and then get the things out that I need and set them aside. Next, I want to make sure that my workstation is clear and ready. So this is an anti-static mat. It does have a connection here for the mat, and I've got one here for myself. And the most important thing is to make sure that you're grounded to the same ground. And for that, an old power supply, just set it to open or off. The O on the switch stands for open or off. The grills are typically connected, as long as there's no paint on it, to the ground. So that will ground this mat, and then I want to be grounded myself. For simplicity, I'll just put this on my ankle and then set this on the ground and it's out of the way. And then I can work on this without any worry about static. All right, with yourself statically protected as well as the work area protected, usually the first thing that I'll do is install the CPU. So typical CPU installation, we'll just do a quick overview on this, not meant to be a tutorial or anything, but LGA 2066 CPUs, it's going to be the same as your 1150X, and it's been that same way since way back in the days, socket 775 and way back then. A little bit before then, CPUs were direct die mounted, and that's how they came from AMD and Intel. Intel's been doing the IHS thing for a while, but old AMD cores, like the Barton core, those were direct die mounted. So we don't have to worry about as much of the delicates of putting the CPU cooler on. But for this one, you'll notice on the CPU that there's always a little golden triangle on it, and that'll match up with the golden triangle, or a black triangle in this case, on the motherboard socket. And in this motherboard, it's actually located on the top. On the top up here. And the gold triangle's on what may be the bottom if the text is oriented. So the way the CPU sits in here is actually upside down. If that bothers your OCD, sorry, but that's just the way this motherboard was designed, probably because of the way they wanted the pins to be laid out. Not a huge deal. On these sockets, there's actually two retention mechanisms, and there's a little number here for the lock and unlock. So the one that says 1 first is where you first unlock, and then number 2. And then that'll open the retention mechanism. You can just simply push down and that'll open the retention bracket. Once that's open, that'll expose the socket. And at this point, always give it a look to make sure that there's really nothing in there. And there are ways to clean this out if you really need to, if you have thermal paste or something for some reason in there, but it's not a whole lot of fun. And you may damage the pins, and the pins are very delicate. They're more likely to actually break off if they bend when you try to bend them back. So that's definitely an issue with these types of sockets. But on the other side, using these LGA style sockets, you only have to replace the motherboard. Instead of like AMD CPUs where the pins are on the CPU, now you've got to replace that CPU. Again, back in the day, you could have got away with possibly dropping the pin into the socket on those types of motherboards and then putting the CPU on top. Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. Sometimes you'll just miss some memory channels, but that's just the way things are designed now. So once you're all ready, the typical way to install a CPU is just to drop it in. But a couple things about stability. Typically, if you have a good 2 points of stability on something, you'll be able to hold your hands much more steady. So if you're in this situation, if you have your elbows on the table, that'll actually help you from dropping it. And that would be the worst case. If you drop the CPU right on the socket, there's a good chance it'll bend some of those pins, and then that'll ruin that socket permanently, and also the motherboard. So this This is a good technique that I use. If you're able to get an elbow on the table, that'll help you stabilize. So before you go holding it over the socket, make sure it's oriented correctly. So the little arrow is on this bottom corner, and that matches with this one. You also notice that there's little indentations on the socket, and those match up with indentations on the CPU. All right, and it's just a matter of getting it lined up and dropping it in. I've seen other people do this before, and it's something I've done for a long time. You don't have to, but in order to make sure it's all set in there, I do kind of feel it. Not a whole lot of movement, because again, if it's not placed properly, you may damage the pins, so be careful of that. But if you give it a feel and you feel that the corners are all level and they're flat and even, and the CPU has just a very small amount of room to wiggle around, that means it's in the right place. If it's stuck or firm, or the level on the corners is not right, then it's probably not in the CPU. Just lift it directly straight up, put it down off to the side, and then take a look at what's going on in the socket. So once you have the CPU in the socket and everything looks good, and only then is when you'll put the retention mechanism back down. So you can just close the lid and you go backwards from the other way you went. So first you'll retain the lid down with the number 2. And once that's down, then what that actually does is locks the retention lid in place, and then the number 1 will actually bring it down to put pressure onto the CPU. So that's the second part. And now pressure is applied to the CPU, and you could simply just pull off the cover. On the LGA 1150s, for instance, the cover pops off on its own. The way this cover is oriented, it actually clips underneath the retention kind of lid, is what I've been calling it. So you can just pull it off yourself. It's not that big of a deal. And once you've done that, now the CPU is installed, and it should be good to go. Hopefully, if you've done it correctly, you'll get all of your memory channels. And then the next thing then is to put in the memory. So for this, I've got it's a kit of 3300 DDR4 CL16. So I don't think it's a B die, but it does have an odd bin of 3300. Probably just slightly better E die or something, but we'll take a look at that once we get it installed and see what's going on. With installing RAM, the only thing you really have to worry about is making sure that the notch is in the same position as the notch on the CPU or on the RAM stick, because the two sides are not equal and you don't want to get it in backwards. But make sure your latches are open. On this one, there's only a latch on one side. The other latch is not a latch. It's just a foreign plastic piece. And I'll usually put in one corner first, find the other corner, and make sure that it's all set down on the socket. That way, if the RAM stick is off to the side, you'll be able to notice that. But if both sides are in, then you just give it the press and you should hear 2 little clicks. And we'll just repeat that for all of the other pieces of RAM. All right, now with the RAM installed, you can make sure that you got all of the clips clipped in. Sometimes when there's 2 clips on each side of the RAM module, one of them may not clip in all the way. And that may be indication that either the RAM is not fully seated or it just didn't clip for whatever reason. So just give it a once over and make sure. If you do have more than 4 RAM slots, so this has a quad channel access to the memory. Most quad channel boards will have 8 slots. This one just has 4 because it's kind of meant for overclocking. But we'll take a look at how that overclocks once we get the rest of the CPU build. Now at this point, I'll typically start setting up the water block onto the CPU. So we'll talk next about thermal paste application on this type of CPU and the thermal block, or sorry, the CPU block that I'm using for my water cooling build.